Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to bring you a very, very strange Algeth'ar Academy run, but one that I thought could be very fun to be able to highlight. So, this is going to be the 24 Algeth'ar Academy run that I am going to be going through, not only, of course, from the Holy Priest perspective, but I also want to be able to give some highlights to how Disc or many other healers are going to handle a lot of the incoming trash, as well as some of the routes and some of the adjustments that we're making for these high keys and to help you get your 20s. So diving into it, we do not have a poison dispel. As a result, you're not going to be able to dispel the poison debuff that gets applied by the Lashers on the first boss, the Overgrown Ancient. As a result, we just kind of said screw it and dove right into this run off the rip. It's really easy to be able to lose people throughout a lot of these aggressive pulls with Lashers. The Skitterflies are usually not too bad, and since we had multiple Raging Soothes, that did make a world of difference. But whenever you get into these pulls from just a damage perspective, making sure you're instantly focusing on those Skitterflies for all the damage, because the stacking enrage effect that they apply to themselves will eventually get the Skitterflies dealing a lot to your different players. I believe that they have changed something since beta, which was allowing you to get sort of double tapped, but it's really tempting to just start sending huge heaps of damage into, for example, all the Hungry Lashers and using a lot of like your overall AoE damage for a Holy Priest or regular Priest. It would just be like through Holy Nova. But in general, every healer spec has some kind of like spammable AoE. And while it's very tempting to just mash that like crazy, you'll find that the Vile Lashers and, of course, the Skitterflies still live for a very lengthy period of time throughout this pull. And so this is indicative of like your overall damage throughout a run, is that there's a lot of times where you can put together lots of extra damage and lots of high overall by mashing your AoE buttons over and over and over again. But it comes at the expense that, at the end of the day, you still have 30-40% health onto these Vile Lashers to get through, and it still eats up more of your time. And so there's a number of different pulls throughout a bunch of different dungeons, every single expansion that are like these pulls, where it'll actually be better for your group's DPS if you are trying to contribute more in the way of single target as you can. So what does this mean? Multi-dotting specifically the Lashers, hitting specifically the Skitterflies with like Holy Fires, you name it, just to make sure you're killing those particular mobs, the highest health mobs, off as rapidly as you can. And there's areas where you can just sit there and spam Smite all the time. It's a lot more productive for you to do single target damage on high health enemies than it is for you to just pound Holy Nova, pound AoE into a bunch of little Lasher mobs that are also just going to die first anyway. Getting into the Overgrown Ancient, yeah, I know we got 3 rogues, and it's going to be a lot easier to be able to heal them as a result, but I'm hoping throughout this we're going to be able to highlight some of the dangers and how you can best prepare for them through a variety of healers. So the big priority that I said to my group is that if we play safe, we're going to be able to kill off this boss in about 3 cycles. Some of the cycles are the bleed effect that the boss is going to apply to the entire party, where you need to use the small tree mob to be able to cleanse yourself of it. As a result, I do end up ripping Divine Word Sanctuary really early on, and then we start pounding damage into that Ancient Branch just to be able to make sure that we are going to be able to remove that bleed effect really early on. This encounter is really easily bricked by people just sort of jumping around and tacking on a lot more problems for each other. When you have this Germinate into Burst Forth combination, for example, we all got hit for about 60-70% of our life with defensives up. Obviously, as a priest, I'm going to get hit a lot harder than rogues, but imagine having that onto your entire group while you have bleed damage going out. It just adds so much extra pressure to the equation that you never really want to deal with. We handled the lack of poison dispels by actually hard kiting a lot of these mobs and really hard AoEing those mobs as well with the double subtlety rogues and black powder. This made it a lot easier for our tank to be able to move around, kite, but we also made a priority to kill off those ads really quickly. And once again, for a lot of these runs, in particular with Algeth'ar, Play safe, get big IO is really the strategy that I would advise almost every group to follow, because if you're getting to the point where you've got 4-piece, you got some decent gear, you usually will be able to chest a lot of these dungeons, like Algeth'ar, just by playing overly safe. So we did put that together. I ripped him on the second bleed application that we had onto us, and again, taking advantage of Divine Word Sanctuary whenever possible. The next wave of ads, you do see the tank put together 20-something stacks of his debuff, and then also have it get refreshed. So this is where I take advantage of Guardian Spirit, and I start adjusting my own positioning if I needed to grip the tank. That was the idea that we had behind it. It's very, very easy for your tank to sort of just fall behind everybody else in terms of their own mitigation, because they have to tank so much extra when the Poison Dispels come into the mix. If you're blessed to have them, just make sure that you or whoever you have in your group that is doing the Poison Dispels is just mashing it on cooldown, and once again, focusing down that Ancient Branch. For every single one of the Ancient Branches, I had Divine Hymn, I had Divine Word, and I always had Apotheosis on the back burner. Since it's a 2-minute cooldown that really accelerates a lot of your Holy Word gen, it made it a priority for me to make sure that if I needed to, and absolutely needed to, I was going to be able to just pound single target output into my tank over and over and over again. So as you can see, with a lot of heavy slows and with the ability for our tank to be able to kite and quickly move away from those mobs, it did make it possible for us to be able to kill off the Overgrown Ancient. First using the Subtlety Rogue's Black Powder to kill off those ads, and then using their funnel DPS to be able to kill off the boss after that. Obviously, with really high damage, it makes the fight a lot easier, but having 3 cycles going around of the bleed effects and having your tank kite 3 times, it does make a world of difference. I guess there was only 2 for the bleeds, but it does make a world of difference to be able to push through the boss, fight through the boss, and be able to kill it off in decently short order. Obviously, the Sentry, not really going to be that big of a deal for you to fight off, and this is always an opportunity for healers to continue to contribute more damage, but also to be mindful of your position around everybody else, as it's very tempting to adjust your position and manipulate your positioning just to be able to get a little closer to the boss for things like Divine Star, and then you can quickly start clogging up melee range and make it harder for everybody else to be able to stand and position themselves. So, once again, be mindful of your positioning in relation to others and kind of how much work it's going to add into the equation for you. From a holy build perspective, I was playing Lightweaver and Divine Word as well. Whenever I play Disc in this dungeon, the problem that I have with Disc is just the mana sustainability. As you'll see on Veximus, as well as the Overgrown Ancient, you can really burn through mana very quickly no matter what spec you're playing. And unfortunately, Disc kind of comes up short when it gets into these highest level keys to be able to continue in that route. So I've been doing some keys, usually a key or 2 lower on Disc, as I'm able to, but there's certain dungeons, I think Algeth'ar is one of them, that most of the boss fights really challenge your ability to continue pumping output. And I think around 10:05, when we have that in around 2 weeks time, they're adding some of the updates to the Mindbender builds, in particular with some of the Mind Blast cost reduction. That probably will be a catalyst for me to play a little bit more Disc, but I think it's still going to have some of those struggles in higher level keys with its mana efficiency, and so that's something I'm always a little bit leery of when healing has this additional challenge at the moment that you don't want to brick people's keys due to a lack of healing, and so as a result, you kind of play overly safe to be able to stay on top of that. Speaking of playing safe, I've been running the Broodkeeper's Promise Trinket from Diurna in the raid, and I just got a Chill Globe. Chill Globe I like over just like a standard damage trinket. I know people are talking about the Ruby life pools like Shell, where you like train your baby dragon to do damage and stuff. That one's really good, but it's also either a pure stat trinket or a pure damage trinket, depending on how you want to train the dragon. So as a result, I kind of like the Chill Globe just a lot more, because you can manipulate it for damage or mana, which in turn you can turn into healing as needed. So overall, these Alpha Eagle packs, nothing's really too crazy with them. Obviously, they're going to be spawning Spiteful, and this also kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, about having to make sure you're prioritizing single target when you can, just because you have 20, 30 seconds of this Eagle just kind of sitting here, and you're not able to pull anything else into it, and everyone just has to be able to sit there, pound single target, and wait for the next pull I'd say you're able to move on. So that's something to always kind of keep in mind as a healer, especially when there's a lot of other responsibilities that you have going on. But Holy Priest Kit allowing you to just mash multiple Holy Fires back to back to back. A lot of times it's good to just pound damage into that individual target and see what's going to be able to come from it. So I believe this is also the trash pull that we did have a death. There were only a couple deaths throughout this run, and a lot of times it was just personal gameplay. Thankfully, like I said, having multiple cheats on hand, having rogue damage reduction, defensive power is really nice, but it's also not required to be able to do like a 20, for example. The way that keys scale is a lot higher than it was in Shadowlands, and so you do feel really big jumps between 18, 19, 20, and onwards, to the point that getting your 20s, especially as you get more gear, and we got the catalyst for tier gear coming in a couple weeks, that's going to make it quite a lot more doable for players, but certainly jumping past the 20 mark into 21, 22, and onto things like 24, there are these really big step-ups in challenges for everybody to be able to take on. One thing with Divine Word is I've been using it very flexibly in high keys just in general. Using it for damage, absolutely wonderful. But unless there's like a specific prio target that's going to live for a long time, I don't really cast lots of smites to force the mob to force apply lots of Holy Fire dots. Just having the Holy Fire dots on their own doesn't really deal a lot of damage. And most of the damage that you get is out of the instant application of Holy Fire. And on top of that, you're often better served taking advantage of the DPS buff in first hitting all the damage, or first hitting the buff, and then following it up with lots of Holy Fire spam on top of that. So it's something to sort of keep in mind when you're utilizing that ability. When we go into Croft, obviously the bird boss, you're going to be able to reset your stacks by triggering some of the goal sets. We opted for, I believe, 4 stacks before we actually triggered the reset on this boss. And so since this boss really lasts a lengthy amount of time, I'm right off the rip adding as much damage as I can. And as I mentioned before, focusing on Divine Words first for damage, and then later on, as I need the mana efficiency, I'll usually opt for using it on Serenity, since everybody needs to be decently spread for the encounter to kind of stay on top of everything. There's also a lot of use for just stretching your mana out. Things like Powered Life are wonderful to take advantage of, for example, because they are so mana efficient, but also when you have to deal with Grievous on top of it, there's a lot of times where the extra spam out of Flash Heal or Heal can really bring your mana down in a rapid format. And so even with certain abilities like Apotheosis that have lengthier cooldowns, it can be really tempting to hold on to them until you absolutely possibly need them. And I'm guilty of it too. But you also can think about it from the perspective of mana savings, in that it's really valuable to reset your Holy Words and get them for free, and also be able to use more of them instead of more Flash Heal or Heal casts. Because while Holy is often very mana efficient, you can, especially with all the haste that I have and I'd like to run in my dungeons, you can also burn down a lot of your resources very, very rapidly. So here, you'll see I do take advantage of a quick mana pot, and I start popping off with my Divine Word onto Chastise to be able to stack up and ramp up a lot of extra damage. The extra damage that you're getting out of the Holy Fire dot, for example, helps a lot when you have to run all over the place. Here, I believe we had a rogue die to just sitting in one of the fire puddles, and then we also triggered our Thundering as a result. And so a lot of times, and I've had it many times this season, when tanks get Thunder Stunned, you do have a good amount of time to work with where you can actually keep your tank alive by gripping them away from melee, keeping them away from harm for just a second or two, so that they can find their ground. Since Croft is such a large boss and large looking boss, it seems like it'd be really tough to be able to sort of get away from him. But his hitbox is so small that he has to like run all the way over to the tank to be able to get him. And that gives you an opportunity as a healer to be able to get your tank away quickly, let him catch his bearings, and then sort of reset the situation. And that's something that you can do extremely well. As a result of all this spam, I've used 2 Divine Words purely on damage, and we're about to approach that 4-stack mark for the Cries. At this point in the top left, on my UI, you can see that we're about to hit the 3-minute mark on the fight, and this is where we trigger the final orb for the rushing winds. And one of the things you always have to keep in mind is that there's tornadoes that spawn almost exactly on top of where these orbs are. And so you have to really take your time in finding them, sort of stabilizing your group, and then also making sure you're pointing out where other orbs are to allies, because the tornadoes continue to be able to manipulate their position and continue to roll all the way around the room. This is also a pretty good example as to why I was not really playing much disc in some of the high keys lately, is that even playing as Holy, I'm still burning through my mana at a very heavy rate, and I'm still able to contribute some damage during my burn phases because of the fact that I'm not having to worry about being so conservative as a result. The tank dot does hurt a tremendous amount. It's nice to be able to channel him. I did it on this encounter for safety. It's nice to be able to get a symbol off. Not necessarily with this group of composition, because the rogue defensive reset's very bad, but if nothing else, your tank or yourself, it does help quite a lot. Once you get past Croft, this is where there's a lot of trash mobs that can sort of kill you off in a million different ways. I found a new way, actually, going through this trash pack, thanks, of course, to the affix with the little minions. It's the, I keep wanting to say the Shrouded, the spiteful affix that we have to deal with this week. So, going through it, this is the only death I believe I had for this run, and it happened directly as a result of these vicious ambushes. As the only ranged player in the group, I'm getting almost all of the Ravager ambushes onto me, and so my priority is to stay very close to the group, because just like the sort of ambush mob that you have to deal with when you're in Halls of Valor, you want to make sure you're standing closer to the group with any of those ambush effects to make it easier for your group to be able to cleave down that priority target. Here, when we have Spiteful going out, I get targeted by the vicious ambush. I get knocked right into my Spiteful mob. Bing, bang, boom. You have your death on your hands. So it's always something to keep in mind from your own positioning. Being able to jump out, rocket jump, be able to just feather and run away as best as you can, being aware of which mob is fixating you via Spiteful. All those things are able to help out. And this is an important area that I can run back at this point in time, but we have one battle res available. We have 2.5 minutes before our next one comes available, and you have just a Ravager left remaining. And so, ideally in this situation, you want to stay up-tempo in your run, continue chain pulling mobs, and rip battle reses as needed, just to be able to force yourself to continue sort of playing through the dungeon without stopping. As you can see with these foragers, we're grabbing these, and we're going to pull a whole lot more, and they deal a decent amount of damage, I would say a moderate amount of damage through their leaps, and they hit a variety of targets. And so when you have to deal with that, plus about a 20 or 30 second run back, and you're dragging everything into the Battle Axe, the Scepter, Mana Fiends galore, on top of Grievous, on top of Fortified, it's a lot better of a play for the value of your entire team to make sure that you're not sitting there waiting on the healer, and you instead rip the battle res to continue processing through this run. In that point right there, we had Yoda getting targeted by a number of leaps, in addition to the arcane... I'm trying to remember the name of the elementals. I think it's the Corrupted Mana Fiends. They'll put this sort of mana bomb on players that'll explode. Yoda has it again, as you can see in the bottom right. And it's exploding for, 50-60% of their life, in addition to all the surge casts that are going out as well. You can see I start picking through the nameplates to find my Spiteful enemy, drop a Chastise stun onto it, and then I continue moving forward with the rest of the group so that all the Spitefuls are in the exact same position they need to be. All the rogues are going to be able to drop all their poisons onto them to slow them, and then I'm right up there with the tank, getting ready for the next pull. Right as we had gotten to this platform, I had ripped my symbol to continue regenning mana. It's always good to be able to communicate with your tank on their own defensives and what defensives you're resetting. Having things like Shield Wall reset for them, if nothing else, makes them a lot more comfortable going into each pull, because it's always a factor of like control. Now that I'm being a lot more conscious of my mana, since we've been pulling almost non-stop for 3 or 4 minutes, right after getting out of a difficult boss fight, I'm using my Divine Word onto Serenity so that all my flash heals and heals are going to be a lot more efficient and a lot cheaper. This is going to allow me to not have to worry about my mana as we continue pulling through this area, and I'm sitting around that 40% mana mark very consistently as we're continuing to run through this spot. This is where the benefit of like Enlightenment comes into play, the benefit of Symbol. If there's decent enough group-wide damage, you can rip, like I mentioned, with Divine Hymn. I don't use a lot of Circle of Healing in most instances, but I will use it a lot when I have to move and I need a free global to cast something, and when I want to be more mana efficient with my resources. It's a decent, cheap heal that's easy to utilize, and as a result, can help you quite a bit in making sure you're keeping allies alive while also not risking a large amount of your mana in the process. So being very aggressive with things like Divine Word into your Serenity save you heaps of mana, because as you can see with Laisha getting that mana bomb on him again, you're getting hit in certain areas for like 60-70% of your life in this fortified, and thankfully that's the only thing going off with casts. When you're doing lower keys, especially those of you out there who are doing pug keys, if you see that target that has a debuff onto them, you absolutely need to spam them, because while they won't take as much damage as they will on a 24 fortified, if extra casts are going into it, if the tank doesn't have full threat on mobs, a little bit of extra damage goes a massively long way in getting somebody killed in pug environments. And so being aware of those debuffs and being aware of the extra damage that can go out onto them makes a world of difference in your own preparedness. And so I'll take advantage of the debuffs that I have, but if you also look at my raid frames, you'll see on our tank, the warrior, there's a very light red outline that goes out onto him periodically throughout the runs. You'll see that sometimes it's also going to highlight onto myself or onto others, and that's an aggro indicator that comes from the Voodoo add-on. And so this will show when certain players are targeted by any enemy in general, and so it allows you to effectively know, without having to watch nameplates, without having to watch really anything but your raid frames, that somebody's being targeted by a mechanic, a casted nuke or spell from a different mob, whatever it is. It's a way of you being able to identify that somebody's going to take some incoming damage, and then you can precast a heal. The Vicious Ambush, for example, throughout all of these runs, when I'm being targeted by it, I have the /save from Bigwigs, but then I also am going to have my nameplates or my raid frames highlight as well, giving me that additional information that I'm able to respond, react to, and start precasting heals to be able to account for. Once again, the Ravager does deal a decent amount of damage, and so as a result, we're grabbing all of these foragers and using the time to be able to deal with like the RP effects nice and early. And since the Ravager still takes a long time to kill, we are going to make sure we're killing it and also killing it far away from the boss with Veximus, so we can pick and choose when we want to go into it. This, I think, is a little extra because we have to do a bit of backtracking in the process, but we do end up pulling everything into this first set of Mana Fiends. And so the way we have it set up with our route at the moment, or the way I had it in this group, obviously it's not my regular group, is we made sure that we were as efficient as we could be in maintaining a lot of damage uptime. Since rogues are not going to really easily re-stealth with things like Spiteful, you're pretty much chain pulling into one thing or another, and the way we're trying to slide into the next pull, into the next attempt, is constantly walking to the next boss, dealing with the RP effects, and then making sure we have the stops and everything that we need so that we're not going to be risking anybody getting kind of like comboed, because the surge effects deal a decent amount of damage, and you can 100% expect a lot of those to go off whenever you're in pug environments, and you're going to be having to worry about whether or not people are kicking some of the scepters or the battle axes, adding more bleeds to the tank, and more headaches for you to deal with. I did get a drink before we chain pulled into the Ravager, and that pays off on the back end here as we start off with Veximus. This is a lot harder than the Evoker boss that you have to deal with in Azure Vault. There's a similar effect. There's the mana bombs and there's like the frost bombs that come out. The difference though is that the mana bombs are dealing ticking damage to you, and the frost bombs are just an instant burst and that's it. With this, you need to really quickly clock in how much damage that these mana bombs are going to deal to you, and then make sure players are consistently above that threshold in health before you feel that you can hit a feather and continue moving. That's always going to be the priority, and it always takes a bit of time as you start pulls to sort of ID how much damage an ability deals to determine how much health players need to have in order to survive it. When you have this knockback in conjunction with the mana bomb, you can see right here, I was on the back foot and I didn't use my mana pot, so I instantly ripped a Guardian Spirit onto myself so that I'm going to be able to survive, not waste the 1 minute cooldown that Guardian Spirit has and turn it into a 3, but better be able to cleave heal my allies who are also taking a lot of damage. This is, of course, where you're able to lean on everybody's defensives around you, and this is also where I'm really, really reliant upon the value of Protective Light out of Holy Priest, out of Fade, and the Fade cooldown reduction. All of those come together in this encounter to make it a lot easier for me to keep my friends alive and very consistently prepare for these mana bomb combinations. Because even though it's not tyrannical, the mana bombs just deal tremendous, tremendous damage. And as you can see, I'm getting myself to like 90%, and then I'm getting hit for about half of my life on this 24 level. So if you're around 21, 22s on tyrannical and you're watching it this week, it'll probably be something similar where you need to keep players above half health, and once you are above half health, they need to make sure they're running out quickly. You need to make sure that you're not still standing in any of the void zones caused by the mana bombs, and then you're going to be able to keep everybody safe. It feels like you have an extra second or two to make sure that you top players before standing in the void zone effects, compared to like Azure Vault, where it's very punishing. If you even stand in there for like a fraction of a second, you'll take a tick. But I would almost always recommend the second that the mana bombs go out, maybe hit a feather and just start spamming everybody to make sure that you're able to keep them alive on this one. One big thing that you always want to keep in mind with your resources, whether it's a health stone or whether it's a health pot, they're really, really powerful this expansion. And so it's of prime importance to you to make sure you lean on those properly, or even call for them if you're playing with a very seasoned group, or you're playing with just friends in voice, that you could almost entirely ignore healing your allies for one of those mana bombs if they commit a health pot to that situation. If they wait until they get to like 30% health, hit the health pot, they'll get topped, maybe take a tick of damage, then go down to like 20 or 30% after the bomb explodes, and then you're going to be able to attribute some more healing to them before the Fissure Burst goes out. It does make a really big difference. Once again, I'm always making sure I'm cycling between a lot of those defensives on the Vexmas fight, because it can be very hard, and all you should really be thinking about when it comes to your resources should be on surviving the mana bombs, as that should be the number one area everyone uses defensives for, and it's likely going to be the area that people are going to die at. A lot of the pulls and enemies going up to Dorogosa look the same. They're just this big shadowy purpley mess of enemies. What's actually scary is called invokers. The invoker will cast these arcane missiles that deal a deceptive amount of damage. They also are going to cast arcane bombs. The arcane bombs can be used to damage all of those Echo Knights, and all the Echo Knights really do is just do whirlwinds all the time and melee the tank. So for rogues with long arms, or just people with a lot of stops, you can even spec in to reduce cooldown on Fear here to be able to continue to help out on the Echo Knights. It's just an easy way to be able to get a lot of trash percentage for very little risk, but you also have to keep in mind that a lot of times throughout these runs that I've seen, or even been in, people mistake all the mobs for looking alike, and then start pulling some of the nastiest mobs out there to try to get more percent. This patrol with the Restorer and double Invoker, for example, and the left side with the double Invoker and the Echo Knight are all traps, and you should not pull them at all. The maximum amount of Invokers that you should have throughout this run is 1. No matter what, there should not be more than 1 Invoker per attempt. They're just very deadly, very annoying. Unfortunately, we also did lose a rogue to just getting meleeed as they were trying to stealth by, but we do, once again, have that battle res. As you can see throughout the run, we have 40 seconds left on our last battle res throughout the run, and going into the boss with 2.5 minutes, we're really, really tight on time just because of how high the key level is, the damage needed to be able to kill off enemies, and some of like the lost tempo that we had as a result of my death and one of the rogues' deaths. And so this is where you can start looking in hindsight as to where you're losing time throughout the run as you're finally getting into the final boss. Overall, the restorers, just have to make sure that they're kicking them, avoiding any sort of the heals that they have going out. And we fully crowd controlled the Invoker just because we knew it was going to be a pain to deal with. Having a caster mob in an instance where there's a lot of mobility required doesn't make for a very fun encounter. And then you go into Dorogosa at the very end. There's a lot of the dragons from the power vacuums that you have to deal with, and I do start working on Shadow Word Deathing and kind of executing off that Recoverer mob, which also means that you have to watch out for the Spiteful that kind of comes around into it. But since we only have Echo Knights and we don't have the Invoker, we don't have to worry as much if mobs are having any sort of issues with casts going off, because all they're going to do is just chase after us like zombies the entire time. It was a little scary having the Echo Knight try to cast his Whirlwind on us, but that's what I had Fear on hand for. And then the rest of the fight, you just have to be disciplined with when you're dropping the bombs. At the third application of that arcane debuff is when you're going to start spawning the bomb factories. Make sure you're dropping them off into the sides of the room. And generally as a range, just make sure that you're sitting near the sides of the room anyway, because getting the instant dispel, popping fade, instantly getting value out of powered life, it does make a good bit of difference as you're going through this run in terms of the extra globals that you need to spend to be able to heal yourself. With Grievous in particular, you can't really rely on Echo or Atonement healing or any of that stuff to eventually get you up to full health before incoming mechanics while you add damage. You have to force your mana lower because of the fact that Grievous will continue to stack, will continue to require more healing, and sort of just drag on and on and on as a result. As you can see, still got 35% left onto the boss's health, and we aren't going to be able to chest this run, but we got very close through it. And I think it's a good highlight of tempo throughout the run, the pace at which you are going and pulling the next set of enemies, how comfortable you and your group might feel with pulling more and more and more, and where your breakpoints really are, when you need to stop, when people need to get mana, when you need to catch your breath. A lot of times I was trying to sneak mana in between the next pulls, but Spiteful gets in the way. And so to lean on that, you have things like mana pots, you have Enlightenment, your talent in the class tree, and you're going to have Symbol of Hope as well in the class tree, or the spec tree, to be able to lean on, to increase your regen, and to play safe. With Disc, when I play more mana efficiently with the spec, I stop casting a lot of Mind Blasts, even though it's really high output with Expiation, and instead, I'll just keep on playing off Harsh Discipline for really cheap smites and penances to be able to top players, to be able to consistently keep my mana in a healthy position, and continue healing as needed. Overall, like I said, Dorogosa is not really a challenging boss, but a lot of the boss encounters here, I would argue, are harder than you would see out of Azure Vault. They're on a similar difficulty, I would say, these days to things like Ruby Life Pools, because there's the last two fights of Ruby Life Pools are extremely nasty. But if you have any other questions or any other content you'd be wanting some more focus on throughout this run, let me know. Hope you all enjoyed the look into Algeth'ar Academy. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to ring the bell, subscribe, all that good stuff if you're interested in more of these dungeon guides. And I'll catch y'all next time.